the US national debt is over $31 trillion. That's more than $94,000 for every single American. But here's the shocking part: the US borrows more money every minute than the average person will earn in their lifetime. How did we get here, and what would happen if suddenly, no one wanted to buy this debt anymore? You might think the US is too big to fail, but history shows that debt crises can happen even to the most powerful economies. If foreign governments like China and Japan stop buying US bonds, the consequences could be massive. Interest rates would skyrocket, the dollar could lose its strength, and inflation could tear through the economy. We've seen warning signs before, but what happens if it all collapses? In this video, we'll dive into what would really happen if everyone stopped buying US debt. From the stock market to your everyday shopping, we'll explore how a shift like this could send shockwaves through the global economy. Stay tuned to discover the truth behind America's dangerous reliance on debt, and the big risks lurking just beneath the surface. Chapter 1: The Great Debt Dilemma. What is US debt anyway? US national debt is a huge sum of money that the government borrows from various sources to cover its spending. At over $31 trillion, it's a number that keeps growing each year. Imagine if your family needed to borrow money to pay for everything. That's kind of how the government operates. But unlike a household, the US can borrow from global investors, like countries and big financial institutions. Essentially, the US issues treasury bonds, which are like IOUs, and promises to pay back the borrowed amount with interest. This interest is a major expense for the government. In fact, interest payments on the debt are expected to hit nearly $1 trillion annually in just a few years. The debt is a product of long-term government spending that exceeds its income from taxes. And unlike a credit card, the government doesn't face the same risks. So, it keeps borrowing, and borrowing, and borrowing. But, here's a twist: this debt is not just a burden. It's also a tool. The US government uses borrowed money to fund everything from military expenses to social security. Without it, the economy would likely slow down dramatically. Think of debt as a kind of financial lifeline that keeps things running smoothly. But how long can this lifeline last before the borrowing starts to catch up? Chapter 2: The Debt Addiction. How the US became a borrowing machine. To understand why the US is so hooked on debt, we need to look back. After World War II, the US borrowed heavily to rebuild the global economy and fund domestic projects like highways and schools. By the 1980s, the US had already accumulated substantial debt, but things took a turn. A shift in policy allowed the US government to borrow more freely, especially with tax cuts and military spending during the Cold War. This marked the beginning of America's debt addiction. As the country faced new crises, like the 2008 financial crash, borrowing became the go-to solution. The US government can borrow at low interest rates because people trust that it will eventually pay back. This made borrowing even more appealing. The debt growth really took off under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, especially with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the 2008 recession. Every year, this addiction to borrowing grows, and with it, the debt. In 2008, the national debt was about $10 trillion. Fast forward to today, and it's more than triple that. While borrowing helps stimulate the economy in the short term, long-term reliance on it can be dangerous. Chapter 3: The Silent Buyers. Who's funding the US debt? The US debt isn't just funded by the American government, it's funded by the whole world. As of now, foreign countries own about $7 trillion of US debt. The biggest players are China and Japan, holding roughly $1 trillion each. But it's not just governments. Big financial institutions like banks and pension funds also play a major role. The Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the US, is another big player. It owns trillions of dollars in treasury securities. But why do these buyers keep purchasing US debt? Simple: US Treasury bonds are considered one of the safest investments in the world. When economies get shaky, people flock to them. In fact, even during the 2008 crisis, demand for US Treasury bonds soared. But what happens if these buyers suddenly stop purchasing? If countries like China decided to stop buying US debt, the US would face higher borrowing costs and potentially a major crisis. Interestingly, the Federal Reserve is also involved in the game of buying US debt. It often buys up bonds to help lower interest rates, which encourages borrowing and spending. This makes the system seem almost self-sustaining. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more insightful content like this. Chapter 4: The Domino Effect. What happens if debt buyers walk away? Now, picture a scenario where everyone suddenly stops buying US debt. It would create a financial shockwave. First, interest rates would likely rise because the government would need to offer higher returns to entice buyers. Higher interest rates would make borrowing more expensive for consumers, businesses, and even the government itself. This could lead to a slowdown in spending and investment across the economy. The stock market might tumble as investors panic about the future. Inflation could also spike because the government might print more money to make up for the lost borrowing. In fact, in 2011, Standard & Poor's downgraded the US credit rating, citing concerns about the growing national debt. This sent shockwaves through global financial markets. It's not just the US that would suffer. Since so many countries hold US debt, a sudden halt in debt buying could destabilize the global economy. When the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. Chapter 5: The Currency Crisis. Could the US dollar lose its power? If debt buyers stop buying US debt, the US could face a currency crisis. The US dollar is currently the world's reserve currency, meaning it's used globally for trade and held in foreign reserves. If confidence in US debt evaporates, foreign countries might reduce their demand for the dollar. This would make the dollar weaker. A weaker dollar could push up the cost of imports, causing inflation to rise. The US could also lose its standing in the global financial system, making it harder to trade and do business with other countries. Other currencies, like the euro or even digital currencies, might step in to fill the void. According to a 2020 report by the Bank for International Settlements, the dollar accounts for about 60% of all global currency reserves. But what if that share started to decline? A currency crisis would make life more expensive for Americans. Everyday items like food, fuel, and electronics would become more expensive. This would hurt the average consumer while making US exports more competitive on the world market. Chapter 6: Reckoning Day. How can the US survive without debt buyers? Let's think about how the US could handle a situation where debt buyers simply vanish. First, it would likely have to make some tough choices. The government might slash spending on things like defense, education, and social programs. However, cutting spending in such a way could have devastating consequences for the economy, potentially leading to a recession. Another option would be to raise taxes, but that comes with its own set of challenges. Raising taxes could slow down economic growth and upset the population. An unconventional option might be to restructure the debt, which would mean renegotiating terms with current debt holders. This is a risky move that could lower the US's credit rating and shake global trust. In 2001, Argentina famously defaulted on its debt, which led to a financial crisis. Could the US face a similar fate? Some experts, like economist Kenneth Rogoff, argue that debt isn't necessarily a bad thing if the government can invest in future growth. But without debt buyers, the US would have to rethink its whole financial system. One thing is clear: the path forward would be complicated, requiring careful balance between spending, taxes, and foreign relations. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so now for more thought-provoking content on the future of the US economy.